Frost had come early to Thornvale that year, and it had come, as frost always did, unevenly. It silvered the west lawn, where the old orangery stood with 3 broken panes patched in oilcloth, and it left untouched the long gravel drive that the head groom swept twice daily for a master who was rarely there to see it swept. Of the 41 rooms in Thornvale Hall, 11 had fires lit before noon. The rest waited, furniture shrouded in holland cloth like a house in perpetual mourning, though the man in mourning had been gone from it for the better part of 6 years. In the east wing, in a chamber no larger than a linen closet that had been given the generous name of under-housemaid's room, Eliza Hartwell woke before the bell, as she always did, and lay for one moment looking at the crack in the ceiling that had, over 11 months, come to resemble a coastline she had never seen. Then she rose, laced her own boots, the left one cracked at the toe, mended twice with waxed thread, and went down to build up fires in rooms whose owners would never know her name. She was 22, and she had been at Thornvale for less than a year, and in that year she had learned the house the way other women learned scripture, entirely, and in private, and with a kind of desperate thoroughness that had nothing to do with duty and everything to do with survival. She knew which floorboard in the second-floor gallery announced a footstep before it fell. She knew that the steward's ledgers, kept in the estate office behind a door that was never locked because no one imagined a housemaid would want in, did not balance, and had not balanced for some time, though she had told no one this, because telling required trust, and trust was not a thing Eliza Hartwell extended easily to grand houses. She had reasons for that. She kept them, like most things, folded small and put away. By the time the breakfast gong sounded above stairs, she had lit 6 fires, aired 2 rooms, mended a torn hem for the second housemaid who could not sew a straight line to save her soul, and settled an argument between the scullery girl and the boot boy, without either of them quite realizing they had been managed. Mrs. Reeve, the housekeeper, watched her do all this with the particular flat attention of a woman totting up a column of figures she did not like. "You've a talent for making yourself indispensable, Hartwell, Mrs." Reeve said, not as a compliment, over the servants' breakfast table. "I've a talent for not wanting to be turned off without a character, ma'am," Eliza said, and went back to her tea and did not say the rest of it, which was that indispensability was the only kind of safety available to a woman with no name worth mentioning and no family left to mention it to. The house had been quiet a long while. It would not stay quiet. That afternoon, word came by outrider that His Grace the Duke of Thornhaven was returning, not in a fortnight, as the last letter had promised, but that very evening, with no more warning than the mud still wet on the messenger's boots. Mrs. Reeve went the colour of the good tablecloth. Fires were lit in 19 more rooms within the hour. Eliza, sent to make ready the master's study, stood for one unguarded moment in the doorway of a room she had cleaned a dozen times, without ever expecting its owner to sit in the chair behind the desk, and felt something in her chest tighten that she chose firmly to call nothing at all. He arrived after dark, in the rain, with mud to the axle and a face that gave nothing away to the row of servants assembled with lanterns in the wet drive. Julian Vane, 7th Duke of Thornhaven, was 30 years old, and had the look of a man who had spent most of them deciding, with some care, to feel as little as possible. He said perhaps 11 words to the assembled household. He did not look at any of their faces long enough to remember them. Eliza, third from the end of the housemaid's row, watched him pass close enough that she could see the fatigue carved under his eyes, and thought, with the clear-eyed contempt of the very tired. Another one who will not notice this house is dying around him. She was wrong about that, though it would be many weeks before either of them discovered it. He did not come down to breakfast for 3 days. He took meals alone in the study, over papers, and Mrs. Reeve reported to the upper servants, with the particular relish of a woman who liked being the only one with information, that His Grace had returned from Vienna in ill temper, having broken off some arrangement there that nobody was permitted to name, and that the household would do well to keep out of his path and keep the accounts tidy, since the new man from the bank was expected within the month to review them. It was the word accounts that made Eliza go still over her mending. She had grown up, before poverty took the growing up away from her early, in a small stone steward's house on the edge of another man's land, at her father's knee, learning to read a ledger before she learned to read a novel. Thomas Hartwell had been the sort of man who believed a column of figures told the truth even when the men who kept it did not want it told, and he had taught his only daughter to read that truth the way other fathers taught daughters to dance. It had been, in the end, the thing that ruined him. A discovered discrepancy, an accusation turned backward onto the man who found it, a dismissal without character that had sent the family from comfortable obscurity into a poverty from which her mother had never recovered, and her father had not long survived. Eliza did not speak of it. She had come to Thornhaven under her plain given name, with a character reference, scraped together by a kind former neighbour, and she had told no one that she had once been a steward's daughter who understood a rent roll better than most men who managed one. She told no one, that is, until the evening she found the discrepancy in Thornhaven's own books, and could not, in good conscience, keep it folded away with the rest of her past. It happened by accident, or what passed for accident in a house she had already quietly mapped down to its bones. She had gone into the estate office near 10 at night to fetch a forgotten shawl left by the second housemaid, and found the ledger open on the desk where the new land agent, Mr. Silas Crane, had left it that afternoon, and beside it, half hidden under a blotter, an older ledger, water-stained, in a hand she did not recognize. That did not match. She should have left it. She told herself afterward, at least a dozen times, that she should have left it. Instead, she sat down in the Duke's own chair, in the dark, with a single candle, and did the thing her father had taught her to do before he had been punished for doing it. She checked the sums. Rents collected did not match rents recorded. The difference was not large enough, she thought, for anyone reviewing the books quickly to notice, but it was consistent, month upon month, a slow bleeding rather than a wound, and it ran back, by her count, at least 3 years. She was still there, candle guttering, a scrap of paper covered in her own small figures at her elbow, when the door opened and the Duke of Thornhaven found a housemaid, sitting in his chair with his ledgers open before her like a woman reading her own fortune. "Explain yourself," he said, not loudly. He was not, she would learn, a loud man. His anger, like most things about him, ran cold and controlled, which she found in that first moment rather more frightening than shouting would have been. She could have lied. She thought about it with the swift, practical calculation of a woman who has been poor enough to know exactly what a dismissal without character costs. But her father had also taught her that a coward with numbers was worse than useless, and something in her, pride, or exhaustion, or simple stubbornness, would not let her shrink into "I was lost, Your Grace. Forgive me," when what was true and what mattered was sitting open on the desk in front of them both. "I was looking for a shawl, Your Grace," she said, and I found that your rents do not add to your rent roll, and have not for some years, and I thought, since I was already caught, that you had better know it from me tonight than from your banker next month, when it will look a great deal worse for the household." He looked at her for a long moment. It was, she would think later, the first time he had properly looked at anyone since he had come home. "And you know this," he said slowly, because I can read a column of figures, your grace, better than most men your father likely employed to do it," she said, and stood and set the candle down and did not curtsy as low as she ought, because her knees, absurdly, would not quite bend that far while he was watching her like that. "I'll leave the ledger as I found it. You may check my sums yourself, or have Mr. Crane check them, and if I am wrong, I will apologize and go back to my fires and trouble you no further." She was not wrong. It took him 11 minutes, standing at the desk with her borrowed candle, to confirm that she was not wrong, and in those 11 minutes something shifted in the room that neither of them yet had the vocabulary to name. "What is your name?" he said finally, without looking up from the page. "Hartwell. Your Grace. Eliza Hartwell." He wrote nothing down, but he did not forget it, either, and that, for a house as large and as forgetful as Thornhaven, was already a kind of beginning. He did not dismiss her, and he did not, as she half expected, elevate her on the spot to some grand new post that would have made her instantly and dangerously visible. He was, whatever else he was, a careful man, and carefulness suited her purposes as well as his own. Instead, over the following weeks, small things began to change in ways that only a household as closely watched as this one would notice. The estate office door began to be, more often than not, unlocked and slightly ajar of an evening. Instructions meant for Mr. Crane sometimes found their way. First, past the housemaid who happened always to be dusting the hall outside the study at the hour the post came in. A question about a tenant's arrears, addressed to no one in particular over a dinner the Duke took alone with his account books, found itself somehow answered the following morning, correctly, in a small folded note left beside his coffee, unsigned. Mrs. Reeve noticed. Mrs. Reeve noticed a great many things, and said very little about most of them, which anyone who knew her well would have recognized as considerably more dangerous than her noticing loudly. Eliza, for her part, told herself sternly, and often, that she was doing nothing more than any conscientious servant might do, that the small increase in his attention, a nod in a corridor, a Miss Hartwell that had begun, somewhere in the second month, to replace the flat Hartwell of before, meant nothing beyond the ordinary courtesy a competent man extended to a competent servant. She told herself this most fervently on the mornings she caught herself, quite without meaning to, choosing to be dusting the same corridor twice. He, for his part, would have said, had anyone been ill-advised enough to ask him, that he was merely making prudent use of an unusually capable member of his household, in the sensible tradition of a man who did not waste good tools. He would have said this with a perfectly straight face, and would have believed it entirely, right up until the November afternoon he found her on her knees in the ruin of the old orangery, with her sleeves pushed up and her hands full of black earth, and discovered that he had, without noticing the exact hour it happened, begun to arrange his days around the possibility of finding her. The orangery had been his mother's, once, in the years before his father's own troubles. Troubles Julian did not speak of, not even to himself if he could help it, though they sat under everything he did, and did not do with money and with trust for the rest of his life. It had gone to ruin, along with a great deal else, and the years his father spent quietly ruining the estate through a steward's betrayal nobody in the family would name aloud. And Julian had not set foot in it since he was a boy of 12, watching a room full of orange trees die, because there was no longer money enough, or heart enough, to save them. He found Eliza there on a grey afternoon, 3 broken panes, newly patched, with oilcloth she had begged from the still room, an old brass watering can borrowed from the gardener's shed at her feet, and the single surviving orange tree, gnarled, half dead, but stubbornly green at its crown, pruned back with a careful hand that clearly knew what it was doing. "You are meant to be airing the blue guest chamber," he said, because it was easier to say that than to say what he actually felt, standing in the doorway of a room he had avoided for 18 years, watching a housemaid coax life back into the one thing in it he had loved. "I aired it an hour since, Your Grace." She did not stop working. This tree wanted saving before it wanted an audience. It has been dying for 18 years. Then it is time someone told it otherwise. She sat back on her heels and looked up at him, not demurely, not the careful downward glance servants were trained into, but directly, the way she had looked at him over the ledgers, as though his rank were a fact about him, and not the whole of him. "My father kept a garden when I was small. He used to say a neglected thing does not know it has been neglected. It only knows whether, today, someone comes." Something moved behind his eyes that she did not then have a name for either. "Your father?" he said, careful, testing the word the way a man tests ice. "You have not spoken of him. There is not a great deal to say that would interest Your Grace." It was the first time she had lied to him, or near enough, and she felt it land wrong in her own mouth even as she said it. He did not press her. He would think, later, that this had been the moment he ought to have pressed her, and that not doing so had cost them both a great deal of unnecessary pain further down the road. But a man raised to distrust every offered confidence learns, too, to be careful how he takes another person's silences apart. He only crouched, instead, awkwardly, in a coat that was not made for crouching, and looked at the small green shoots she had coaxed from black soil, and said, "Show me what wants doing," and stayed an hour longer than either of them could afterward quite account for. It became, after that, a habit neither of them named. An hour most afternoons in the orangery, while glass was slowly reordered from the county town and delivered a pane at a time, while cracked stone troughs were mended and new soil was carted in, while a dead room began, panel by panel, leaf by leaf, to breathe again. He talked, in that green half-light, more than he had talked to anyone in years, not of Vienna, and not of the broken arrangement no one was permitted to name, but of small things. A horse he had loved as a boy, a tutor who had been kind to him, the particular quality of silence in a house where his father had stopped. Quite early, trusting anyone at all, she listened the way she did everything, thoroughly, and gave back small true things of her own in careful measure, and did not tell him about the steward's house, or the dismissal, or her father's name. One wet afternoon in the second week, he found her not among the orange trees, but in the estate office again, past the dinner hour, a stack of old rent receipts spread before her, like a hand of cards she was learning to read. She had taken, without quite asking leave, to cross-checking the current quarter's accounts against the previous year's, in the quiet hours when the rest of the household had gone to bed, because the discrepancy she had first found troubled her more than she liked to admit, and because it was, she told herself, only prudent to be certain a single evening's arithmetic had not been a mistake. "You are meant to be asleep, Miss Hartwell," he said, though he made no move to send her there. So is your Grace. And yet. She did not look up. The numbers are worse than I first thought. Not larger. The same small amount, taken every quarter, as though whoever does it has decided precisely how much a house this size will never miss. But it goes back further than 3 years. I found an entry from 6 years past tonight that does not sit right, and I cannot yet say why. He drew a chair to the desk, without being asked, and sat across from her the way he might have sat across from a fellow officer poring over a map, and for the better part of an hour they worked in companionable silence, broken only by the scratch of her pencil and the occasional low exchange. Does this figure match the one above it? What do you make of this hand? Whose initials are these? Until the candle had burned low, and his knee, quite by accident, came to rest against hers beneath the narrow desk, and neither of them moved to correct it. You do this as though it were a pleasure, he said at last, watching her work rather than the page. Most people would call an evening spent with a stranger's old accounts a punishment. My father used to say a column of figures was the one place in the world where nobody could lie to you twice. She smiled, briefly, down at the page, and something in the smile was old and tired, in a way that made him want, quite suddenly and with an intensity that startled him, to ask what had put it there. He did not ask. He only watched her hand move down the column, sure and quick, and thought, with the particular clarity of a man noticing a thing he has been failing, for weeks to notice, that he had not once, in that hour, thought of Vienna at all. He reached once to turn the page for her before she had finished with it, and their fingers met over the paper, and both of them went still. He did not take her hand. He wanted to. She could see in the sudden careful blankness of his face that he wanted to, and that the wanting frightened him rather more than it pleased him, and he withdrew his hand a half-second before propriety would have required it, and cleared his throat, and asked her, in a voice not entirely steady, whether she thought the discrepancy might be traced through the old steward's correspondence. It was the first of what would become, over the following weeks, a small collection of such moments, a reach not completed, a word not quite spoken, a look held a beat too long and then deliberately released, and Eliza began, despite every sensible instinct she possessed, to catalogue them the way she catalogued figures, privately, and with a growing and unwelcome hope she did not yet dare examine too closely. It was in the 6th week of the Orangery's slow resurrection that Mrs. Reeve's daughter arrived to stay. Charlotte Reeve, 19, pretty in the unremarkable way of a girl raised to be pleasant to those above her and sharp to those below. Sent by her mother, everyone understood without anyone saying it, to be seen by the Duke as often as could be arranged. We will take a very short break. If you do not want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. Mrs. Reeve had been housekeeper at Thornhaven for 11 years, since shortly after the previous steward, her own late husband, Josiah Reeve, had died, and in those 11 years she had built, with the patient thoroughness of a woman who trusted nothing but her own labour, a small private understanding of exactly how much a great house's inattentiveness could be made to yield if a person were careful and consistent and never ever greedy enough to be noticed. It had begun small in the last years of the old Duke's declining health, when nobody above stairs had the will to check a column of figures too closely. It had continued, easily, comfortably, into the young Duke's long absence abroad. It existed in Mrs. Reeve's own private accounting of herself, not as theft but as provision, a widow's due, a portion set carefully aside, year upon careful year, For the daughter she meant to see married well, because she herself had once been promised well, and married instead a man whose own sins she had spent a decade quietly covering. And she was not. She told herself with the particular fierceness of the frightened, going to watch Charlotte inherit nothing but her mother's caution. She had not been alarmed, at first, by the new housemaid's cleverness with figures. Servants noticed things. Servants who valued their positions learned to notice nothing at all, and Mrs. Reeve had assumed Eliza Hartwell would learn the same lesson quickly enough. She had not expected the Duke to notice her noticing. She had not expected, above all, the particular and unmistakable warmth that had begun, in 6 short weeks, to enter his Grace's voice whenever the housemaid's name arose, a warmth she recognized instantly, having spent a lifetime reading the small weathers of powerful men, and which, she understood with the cold clarity of a woman calculating a threat, could end everything she had spent 11 careful years building. She began, quietly, to move against her. It started small, as such things generally do. A missing thimble found later in Eliza's work basket, though Eliza would have sworn on her father's grave she had never touched it. A whispered word to the head housemaid that Hartwell was growing above herself, spending too much time in rooms that were not hers to be in. A letter, never sent, only threatened, in a conversation designed to be overheard, to the agency that had supplied Eliza's character, questioning whether the reference given had been entirely honest. Small cruelties, private ones, delivered with a housekeeper's absolute authority over a housemaid's daily life. Extra duties assigned without cause, a half-day's leave promised and then withdrawn, a public correction over some trivial fault delivered in front of the whole servants' hall, with a precision clearly meant to wound. Eliza bore it the way she had learned, young to bear most things, quietly, without complaint, telling herself it would pass, telling herself she had weathered worse. She did not tell the Duke. She did not in truth entirely understand yet how much was being done to her on purpose, rather than simple ill-temper. Mrs. Reeve was too skilled a hand at cruelty to make it look like anything but bad luck and a difficult character. What Eliza did not see, because it was never meant for her to see, was the second stage of it, moving beneath the surface of the house like water finding a crack in old stone. Mrs. Reeve began, in the 3rd month, to talk, carefully, sorrowfully, always as though reluctant to say it at all, to the other senior servants, and through them, in the slow contagion of a great house's gossip, to the wider circle of the neighbourhood's own servants' halls, and from there, inevitably, to the drawing-rooms above them. A pity, really, about the new housemaid and his Grace. Not that anything improper had occurred, of course, Mrs. Reeve would never suggest such a thing. Only that a girl so very eager to make herself agreeable to a lonely man, and so very mysterious about her own history, did make a body wonder. No character worth the name when she came. No family anyone could name. Clever with figures in a way that struck some as less a gift than a design, it reached Lady Ashworth, the Duke's aunt, before it reached Julian himself, arriving at Thornvale a full fortnight ahead of the house party she had been planning since spring, ostensibly to help oversee the preparations. In truth, to look the situation over with her own sharp eyes and, if necessary, correct it. She found Eliza in the linen room one grey morning, and looked at her for a long, assessing moment with the cool thoroughness of a woman who had spent 40 years learning to price a person at a glance. "You are a very handsome girl," Lady Ashworth said, without preamble, which is, in my experience, rarely a kindness done to a woman in your situation. My nephew is not a fool, whatever the county may whisper, but he is lonely, and loneliness makes fools of cleverer men than him. I would ask you to consider, before this goes further, what precisely you imagine the end of it to be. I imagine nothing, my lady, Eliza said, which was, by then, no longer entirely true, though she said it steadily enough. I clean the grates, and mend the linen, and keep his Grace's accounts honest, when they will let me. If gossip has made more of it than that, the gossip is not mine to answer for. Lady Ashworth's mouth thinned, not unkindly. See that it stays no more than that, she said, for both your sakes, and left Eliza standing among the folded sheets with a cold new understanding that whatever quiet thing was growing between herself and the Duke had already, without either of them choosing it, become a thing other people had begun to watch and weigh, and, in at least one case she had not yet identified, actively work to destroy. It was the ledger that changed the shape of things. The same ledger, in fact, that had begun everything. Eliza had continued, in the weeks since that first candlelit evening, to keep her own quiet accounting alongside the estate's official one, partly from the old habit her father had drilled into her, and partly, if she was honest with herself, because it gave her an excuse to remain useful to a man whose good opinion had come to matter to her rather more than was wise. In late November, cross-checking a column of tenant payments against the original rent book, she found something that stopped her breath entirely. An old entry in a cramped, careful, water-stained hand she now recognized, because she had spent a childhood watching that exact hand fill exactly such columns as her own father's. Thomas Hartwell had been steward, briefly, at Thornhaven itself, in the years before the scandal that ruined him, years before Eliza's own birth was old enough to remember clearly, in a household then managed under the old Duke, Julian's father. She had known, vaguely, that her father's ruin had come from some great house in the county. She had never known, because her mother had never been able to bear speaking the name aloud, that the house had been this one. The entries in her father's hand were meticulous, honest, and abruptly ended a full 3 years before the discrepancies Eliza herself had first uncovered began, which meant, she understood with a slow, sick clarity, that whoever had begun the slow bleeding of Thornhaven's rents had done so only after Thomas Hartwell was no longer there to catch them at it. Which meant her father had not been dismissed for the theft he was accused of. Which meant someone else, someone still, perhaps, within these very walls, had used his good name to hide their own hand, and had done it once already, successfully enough that they had, in all likelihood, simply begun again. She sat a long while with that knowledge before she dared act on it, because acting on it meant telling Julian who she was, and telling Julian who she was meant risking everything the last 2 months had quietly, carefully built between them, meant becoming, in his eyes, not the clever housemaid he had grown fond of, but the daughter of the man his own father had once dismissed for theft, with all the old ugly questions that would raise about her motives in coming here at all. She told him anywhere. She had never, in the whole of her hard young life, been able to hold a true thing back from someone who deserved to hear it, however much it cost her. She had almost not gone to him at all. She had stood outside the study door with her father's rent book pressed to her chest for the better part of 10 minutes, telling herself that the safer course was silence, that she had already lost one home to a truth nobody wanted told, and could not survive losing a second. It was only the memory of her father's voice. The truth does not change whether or not it is convenient, Eliza, that finally moved her hand to the latch. Julian, for his part, would tell her much later that he had heard her hesitate outside the door, had heard the small catch of her breath through the wood, and had very nearly opened it himself before she found the courage to do so. A small, unfinished gesture neither of them mentioned at the time, but which both of them, separately, carried away from that evening as a kind of promise. He listened, in the study, with the ledger and her father's old rent book open between them, and said nothing for a long while after she had finished, long enough that she began, with a familiar cold sinking, to prepare herself for the dismissal she had half expected from the first candlelit night they'd met. "My father dismissed your father," he said at last, very quietly, on the word of Josiah Reeve. The name landed between them like a struck bell. Eliza had not known it, had never had reason to connect the housekeeper's dead husband to her father's ruin. Not until that exact moment, watching Julian's face go the particular still white of a man, reordering his entire understanding of his own house. "Mrs. Reeve's husband was your father's steward before mine," Julian said. "He died the year I came into the title. I never questioned the accounts he left behind. I had no reason to. I have questioned very little, in this house, in a very long time, Miss Hartwell, and I am beginning to understand that this has cost people I ought to have protected a great deal. It was not, yet, proof of anything. A dead man's old sins and a living woman's current ones are not the same evidence, and both of them knew it. But it gave shape, finally, to the shadow that had been moving through Thornavale's account books for years. And it gave Eliza, for the first time since her father's death, something she had not let herself hope for: the possibility, however distant, of his name restored. There was, in the days that followed the study's revelation, one further exchange that Eliza would carry with her long after the rest of that season had faded. She came upon Mrs. Reeve alone in the still room, late, counting preserves by candlelight with a concentration too fierce for so small a task, and for a moment, before the housekeeper's face closed over again into its usual careful blankness, Eliza saw something in it she had not expected to see. Not malice, but a kind of naked, exhausted fear. The fear of a woman who has spent 11 years building a wall around a single soft place and felt it, at last, beginning to crack. "You think me a monster," Mrs. Reeve said, not looking up from the jars. "I think you frightened," Eliza said, before she could stop herself. "I have been frightened too, ma'am, in my time. It does not excuse what has been taken, but I understand it well enough not to hate you for it." For one unguarded instant, Mrs. Reeve's hands went still over the jars, and something in her throat worked as though she meant to speak. To explain, perhaps, the husband whose sins she had spent a decade quietly covering. Or the daughter she could not bear to watch inherit her own hollow-cheeked poverty. And Eliza, watching, thought she saw the whole shape of a confession rise up in the older woman and very nearly break the surface. Then Mrs. Reeve's mouth pressed thin again, and the moment passed, and she said only, "Mind your own hearth, Hartwell, and I will mind mine," and Eliza left her to her jars, understanding, with a pity she had not expected to feel and could not quite set down, that she had been off and had watched refused. One last chance for the older woman to choose a different ending for herself. Mrs. Reeve struck before they were ready. It happened 3 days before the small house party Julian's aunt, the Dowager Lady Ashworth, had arranged months before his return, a gathering meant. Everyone in the county understood, perfectly well, to bring the Duke into company with Miss Vivienne Colworth, A well-dowered young woman, his aunt had long considered the obvious remedy for both his loneliness and his estate's uncertain finances. Mrs. Reeve, sensing the ground shifting beneath her in ways she did not yet fully understand, but felt with an animal's instinct for danger, moved to remove the threat before the party could bring matters to any kind of crisis. A brook went missing from Miss Colworth's room the very morning of her arrival, a valuable thing, sapphire and pearl, reported at once to the housekeeper, who declared with grave and sorrowful authority that she had, with regret, observed Hartwell handling the young lady's jewel case unattended not an hour before. A search of Eliza's small room turned up the brook itself, tucked with damning neatness into the toe of her second boot. Eliza had never seen the brook before in her life. She said so, plainly, to the assembled upper servants, and was believed by exactly no one but the scullery maid, who had no standing to speak for her. She was dismissed within the hour, without character, by a housekeeper acting correctly, by every rule of the house, within her own proper authority, and the Duke was from home that day, gone to the county town on business he could not delay, and did not return until well after dark, by which time Eliza Hartwell had already packed her few things into the same small trunk she had arrived with 11 months before, and stood in the cold at the servants' entrance with nowhere in the world left to go, and no character to carry her to any place that might take her in. She stood there longer than was sensible, in the frost, looking back once at the lit windows of a house she had, without ever quite meaning to, come to love, not for its grandeur, which had never impressed her, but for the small green room she had brought back to life, and the man who had knelt beside her in it, awkward in his good coat, and asked her, at last, what wanted doing. She thought, in that cold and bitter hour, of walking away and letting her father's name lie buried where it had lain for a decade, because fighting for it had already cost her the only safe place she had found since his death, and fighting further might cost a great deal more. She thought of it, and then she thought of him teaching her, at 6 years old, to add a column twice before trusting the sum. Because the truth, Eliza, does not change whether or not it is convenient. And she picked up her trunk, and instead of walking down the drive toward the road, she walked around to the front of the house, where the party guests were even then arriving in their carriages for the first grand evening of Lady Ashworth's gathering, and she walked in through the front door of Thornavale Hall for the first and only time in her life. The hall was full of candlelight and silk, and the particular bright chatter of people who have never once had to wonder where they would sleep. Julian was at the top of the great staircase, newly returned, still in his travelling coat. Being informed by his aunt of the day's unfortunate business with the missing brooch and its thieving housemaid, when the doors below opened on the cold night air, and Eliza Hartwell walked in with her trunk still in her hand, and every eye in the hall turned to look at her. "Your Grace," she said, and her voice did not shake, though everything else in her wanted to. "I did not take Miss Colworth's brooch, and before I leave this house I mean to prove it, because I have already lost one name to a lie in this family's service, and I will not lose a second." The silence that followed had weight enough to feel. Julian came down the stairs. He did not come down them slowly, the way a duke is meant to descend among his guests, weighing every step for its dignity. He came down them the way a man comes downstairs, when something he has decided matters more than anything watching him. Quickly, unevenly, his aunt's protest, and Miss Colworth's small gasp, and Mrs. Reeve's sudden pale stillness all falling away behind him like things already finished with. "You will not need to prove it alone," he said, and turned to the room at large, to his aunt's outraged face and the sea of watching guests, and spoke in the voice of a man who has, for the first time in a very long while, stopped being afraid of what the truth might cost him. "This woman," he said, "has spent 11 months quietly saving this house from a theft that began before she ever set foot in it. She found the discrepancy in my rent rolls the week I returned, sitting up past midnight with a borrowed candle when she might have said nothing at all and kept her position safe. She has restored, with her own 2 hands, a room I had not been able to enter in 18 years. And her father, Thomas Hartwell, was steward at Thornhaven before Josiah Reeve, and was dismissed on Josiah Reeve's word for a theft I now have very good reason to believe Josiah Reeve committed himself. Mrs. Reeve had gone the colour of old wax. Your Grace, this is, I found the true rent book 2 hours ago. Mrs. Reeve, in the false-backed panel behind the estate office shelving, where your husband kept the copies that did not match what he showed my father. Julian's voice did not rise. It did not need to. Thomas Hartwell's own hand is in it, honest to the last entry he ever made here. Your husband's hand continues it afterward, and continues it dishonestly, for 3 years, and the pattern repeats, Mrs. Reeve, down to the very shillings, in the current book, in your hand. Charlotte Reeve had begun, very quietly, to cry. Mrs. Reeve did not. For one unguarded moment her whole careful composure cracked open, and beneath it Eliza saw, with a pang she had not expected to feel, not triumph, but something closer to pity, an old widow's fear, worn 11 years thin, of watching a daughter inherit nothing but the same poverty that had made her mother desperate enough to steal for her. Then the mask came back up. Brittle and Mrs. Reeve said nothing further at all, which was, in its own way, confession enough. As for the Brooke, Julian went on, turning at last to Miss Colworth, whose face had gone through several shades of confusion and now settled on something close to relief. I think we will find it was placed where it was found by the same hand that has for years needed someone else's name to hide behind. Lady Ashworth stepped forward at this, her face a study in conflicting loyalties, and for a moment it seemed she might speak against the whole proceeding on the grounds of propriety alone. A duke did not conduct inquiries into stolen jewellery in his own front hall, before his own guests, like a magistrate at the county assizes. But she had known her nephew's mother, once, and had grieved with him, quietly through every cold year since, and something in his face tonight. Open. Unguarded, entirely unlike the careful young man who had come home from Vienna 11 weeks before, stopped her protest in her throat. She closed her mouth and folded her hands and waited, as the rest of the room was waiting, to see what the truth, once let loose in a ducal hall, would do. It was, in the end, the scullery girl, small, overlooked, exactly the sort of person nobody thought to silence, who confirmed she had seen Mrs. Reeve near Eliza's room that very morning, with something small held close in her apron. She had said nothing of it at the time, she admitted, twisting her hands, because Mrs. Reeve was the housekeeper, and she was nobody at all, and nobody at Thornhaven had ever taught her that what she saw might one day matter to anyone above her station. Julian thanked her, gravely, by name, in front of the whole assembled company. A small thing. And yet the girl's face, hearing her own name spoken with respect by a duke, for perhaps the first time in her life, told Eliza that some of what this house had broken might, slowly, be mended after all. Julian crossed the remaining distance of the hall and stood before Eliza in front of the whole assembled company of his aunt's most important guests, and did not, in that moment, care in the smallest degree what any of them made of it. I have spent this house's whole trouble learning, slowly, that competence and kindness are not things a title can buy and rank cannot manufacture, he said, quietly enough that it was, somehow, still meant only for her, though every person in the hall heard it. You brought a dead room back to life without being asked. You told me a hard truth the very first night I ever properly looked at you, at cost to yourself, when a lie would have been safer. You have more of my father's steward's honesty in you than his own accounts ever showed, and I find I would rather have that in a wife than a fortune in a settlement. He glanced, briefly, without malice, toward his aunt and toward Miss Colworth, who had the grace to look more relieved than wounded. I am aware of what this costs the arrangement my aunt has hoped for. I find I mind that considerably less than I mind the thought of you walking back out that door. Eliza set down her trunk. Her hands, she noticed distantly, were shaking, though her voice, when it came, was not. Your Grace, she said, I came into this house owning nothing but a false name's worth of shame and a talent for figures nobody wanted. I find I am not willing to leave it owning less than the truth. Then stay, he said, and let the truth be what it is. She did. Mrs. Reeve left Thornavale before the week was out, her position and her borrowed dignity both forfeit, though Julian, mindful, in the of an old widow's fear more than her sins, settled a small sum on her and Charlotte sufficient to keep them from actual want, on the single condition that the truth of Josiah Reeve's theft and Thomas Hartwell's innocence of it be entered formally into the estate's own records, where any future steward or banker might read it and know exactly whose name had earned trust and whose had only borrowed it. It was not forgiveness. Precisely, it was, Eliza thought, watching the carriage go, something closer to the particular regency mercy of a household that had learned, at cost, the difference between punishment and repair. The weeks between that night and the wedding were not, as Eliza had half feared they might be, weeks of easy triumph. Grief in a great house does not clear all at once, merely because a wrong has been named. The household had to relearn itself, servant by servant, around the sudden absence of a housekeeper 11 years familiar, and the sudden, still strange presence of a duke who now asked opinions of people he had once barely seen. Eliza herself found the transition from housemaid to intended duchess a stranger country than she had expected. There were mornings she woke reaching, from old habit, for her apron before she remembered she need not. There were dinners at which she sat, newly gowned, at a table she had once only ever cleared, and felt every eye in the room measuring the distance she had crossed to reach it. Julian, watching her falter once over the correct fork at a dinner meant to formally welcome her into the county's notice, reached beneath the table and took her hand, not to correct her, but simply to hold it, and said, "Low enough for her alone, I did not choose you for your forks, Eliza." And she found, laughing despite herself, that the whole weight of the evening's watching eyes suddenly mattered a good deal less. Thomas Hartwell's name was entered, that spring, into the estate's own permanent record, exactly as Julian had promised, a formal correction in the Duke's own hand, stating plainly that the steward dismissed a generation before had been innocent of the theft laid at his door, and that the true debt lay elsewhere. It was not the sort of restitution that could restore the years her father had lost, or the mother who had not lived to see it, and Eliza wept over the entry, alone, in the estate office, longer than she had wept over anything since her father's funeral. not from grief alone, this time, but from the strange, fierce relief of watching a wound finally close that she had carried, silently, for the whole of her adult life. She had promised herself once, standing over her father's modest grave, that she would never again let anyone's convenience decide what was true about her family. Reading her father's name restored in a duke's own careful hand, she understood, at last, that she had kept that promise. The wedding took place the following June, in the small stone chapel on the Thornvale grounds, with considerably less grandeur than Lady Ashworth would have preferred, and considerably more genuine happiness than most of the county's grand weddings could claim. Eliza wore, pinned at her collar, the one object she had carried with her through every hard year since her father's death, a small ivory-handled letter knife, cracked along one edge, engraved with the initials T.H., which he had used to open his letters at the steward's desk in this very house 3 decades before, and which she had kept, without ever telling anyone why, as the last proof that a Hartwell had once been honest here, and would be honest here again. The orangery by then was in full and stubborn bloom. The old orange tree, saved from 18 years of neglect by a housemaid's patient hands, heavy that June with small green fruit, not yet ripe, and a dozen new plantings besides, filling the glass room with a green, living warmth that had not touched Thornvale in a generation. It was there, among the restored trees, that the wedding breakfast was laid, at Eliza's own quiet insistence, because it seemed to her the truest place in the whole great house to begin a marriage, not in a ballroom built to impress strangers, but in a room that had been dead, and was not dead any longer, because someone had come back to it, day after day, and asked it what wanted doing. A year after that, in the same green room, with the orange tree's fruit ripening gold above them, Julian found his wife exactly where he always found her at that hour, on her knees in the black soil, hands busy, humming some tuneless thing under her breath, and knelt down beside her in a coat that was, by now, rather better suited to the work, and asked her, as he had asked her that very first grey afternoon, what wanted doing. She looked up at him, sun through cracked mended glass falling gold across her face, and told him, and he did it, and that, in the end, was the whole of their happiness. Not a single grand rescue, but 1,000 small mornings of showing up, together, for a house, and a marriage that had, at last, learned it would never again have to wonder whether anyone was coming. That is where we will leave the Duke and Duchess of Thornvale, among the orange trees they raised back from ruin together. Thank you, as always, for spending this story with us. If it moved you, we would love for you to subscribe, so you never miss the next one. Instead of running away, the exhausted little deer collapsed softly into the grass. Noah stayed beside it until its breathing became calm. He gently carried the frightened fawn to a sheltered spot near his home, where he could keep an eye on it while it recovered. The first thing he offered was fresh water. The fawn hesitated, but after watching Noah for a few moments, it slowly began to drink. That evening, Noah wrapped the little deer in a clean, soft towel to keep it warm. The fawn rested quietly against him, no longer trembling as badly as before. Over the next several days, Noah cared for it patiently. He kept it comfortable, offered it suitable food, and spent time nearby without frightening it. He even turned feeding time into a little game, placing small pieces of its favorite food nearby and encouraging it to search for them on its own. Soon, something remarkable began to happen. The fawn started waiting for Noah. Whenever he appeared, its ears lifted and its tail moved excitedly. It would follow him around the yard, gently nudge his hand with its nose, and sometimes rest beside him while he sat on the porch. Noah never tried to force the bond. He simply gave the little animal time, patience, and care. Weeks passed, and the fawn grew stronger. One morning, it followed Noah farther than usual before suddenly stopping at the tree line. A small herd of deer was waiting nearby. Noah expected it to run toward them. Instead, the fawn turned back. It walked toward Noah, gently pressed its head against his hand, and stayed there for several quiet seconds. Then, it finally ran toward the herd. From that day on, whenever the deer returned to the woods, it always looked for Noah first. Sometimes animals cannot tell us they are grateful. They simply remember the person who cared enough to save them.